Order, good afternoon and welcome to the Women and Equality Select Committee. Today we are here holding our first ever session on equality at work, paternity and shared paternity leave. First we'll hear from Joeli Brearley, founder and director of Pregnant and Screwed, Karla Capstick, director at Better Start Nottingham and the National Children's Bureau, Imanuel Ben Israel, dad and programme participant from Better Start, and Lloyd Hunter, co-founder of the Dad Shift. Welcome everybody and thank you so much for being here. We're going to get straight into it and I am going to hand over to Samantha.
Firstly, I apologise for my voice. It's disgusting. Be loud enough just so that I can not squeak. Welcome, thank you. It's very nice to see you here today. I'm going to come to Alex first, if I may. Can you tell us a little bit about what motivated you to launch the Dad Shift?
Sure. So for me, this came out of my experience of my own dad. Obviously, back in his day, there was no paternity leave at all. So my older brother was born 9 o'clock on a Sunday night. He was back at work 12 hours later, 9 a.m. the next day. And he worked long hours. We didn't really see him 5 days a week. As a result, he wasn't really involved in looking after us. And we never bonded with him in the same way we did with my mum. And ultimately that contributed to the breakdown of his marriage, that distance between him and the rest of the family unit. And we're much closer as adults, and I have a 3-year-old son. And to my surprise, in many ways, he's become a very kind of soppy, devoted grandparent. And that's given us a frame to talk about his experience as a dad. And he deeply feels like he missed out. And he said this thing to me that really sticks with me, is that I just didn't know there was a different way of doing it. It just wasn't an alternative. And I think even though our attitudes have changed a lot since then, a lot of the structures in place that make it hard for dads to be a bigger part of their kids' life haven't changed that much. And his experience is still the experience of too many men. And that is bad for men themselves. It's bad for their kids who miss out on that relationship with their fathers. And of course, it's bad for women who end up shouldering the burden of childcare alone in many cases. And the more I started looking into this and reading about the work that organisations like Pregnant and Screwed have been doing, which has been brilliant, and realised that we need more dads to be out here calling for this, because it's something that we want and we care about and will benefit us. And it didn't sit right that we were leaving it to mums to fight for this on our behalf. So for me, that's why this came out.
Excellent. How many men have signed up?
Sorry?
I'm so sorry. How many men have signed up to your campaign?
We've got so far around 16,000 people who've signed up. We don't know exactly how many are dads or not, because we don't always collect that data, but several thousands of them are.
And would you say there's evidence of a cultural shift in appetite for shared parental leave?
Definitely, yeah. The evidence we see is that there is almost universal support amongst not just dads, but actually the public as a whole, towards the idea that dads should be more involved in their kids' lives. So we've done polling that shows 90% of fathers agree that these days fathers want to be more involved in their kids, that 86% of people agree that it's better when both parents have a chance to be equally involved in childcare, have equal opportunities for that, rather than just one parent shouldering it alone. I think what's really important about that is it's not, you sometimes come up against this kind of reflexive assumption that this is a woke issue that only middle-class dads in cities care about. And actually all the evidence we see is that this is something that people across the country, whatever jobs they do, however much they earn, whatever their political affiliation, this is something they care about too. And fundamentally, this is an issue about how we as a country support working families, whether we do that properly or not. And as an example of that, I recently met a self-employed tradesman called Tom, who, for both his kids, they were both born premature. His wife had emergency C-sections both times. And he did the right thing. He stepped up. He took 6 weeks off unpaid. As he's self-employed, he got no paternity pay at all. And to look after his babies and look after his partner. And he says 6 years later, he has still not recovered financially. And the financial stress that's put on them as a family has destroyed his mental health, his wife's mental health, and drove him to the point where he attempted suicide. And that is what this issue means to a lot of families across the country. It's something that affects everyone, and all the evidence we see is that everyone in the country wants this to happen.
On a personal note, my daughter is now 17, and I was very fortunate. I'm no longer with her dad. He was very hands-on. Her relationship with her dad is wonderful. It's enabled me to pursue a career. She also now has different role models in both of us. And so I feel like you're preaching to the converted here. But it does actually naturally bring me on to another question. So I'll turn to you, Karla, if I may. The NCB submission says that gender equal parenting contributes to a multiple of positive outcomes. So can you describe some of the key benefits for children and families?
Yeah, I mean, the Better Start sites were set up to predominantly focus on pregnancy and early child development outcomes. So we were very focused on improving outcomes in babies and children around speech and language, diet and nutrition, social and emotional, and also try and bring about long-lasting systems change. And one of the areas, therefore, that all 5 are Better Start sites, that's in Blackpool, Lambeth, Southend, Nottingham and Bradford, have focused on, is how we make our services more inclusive and accessible for all. We're very much a progressive universal approach, so these services have been open to everybody, but we've recognised through the work that we've done that fathers are, not deliberately, but have been an excluded group. If you think about maternity and postnatal services, they're predominantly aimed at women, and I appreciate and understand why that is. But as Alex has just highlighted, you know, society's changed now. Fathers are wanting to step into that space and play a more active co-parenting role in supporting the upbringing of their children, and yet we don't have the structures and the services that are there and able to support them in that way. Some of the wider benefits we've seen is if you have the ability to support fathers in playing that more active role through things like parental leave reforms, through things like greater understanding by employers, etc., then it really is a kind of a triple win in terms of policy, because not only do you then start to address some of those gender stereotypes that Alex has touched on, and you can really start to think about how do we bridge and start to shift the kind of gender pay gap that we see for women and some of those structural inequalities that exist for women, but also how do we start to shift the narrative around men as well, and that they do want to be, kind of actively involved, equal co-parents. And this has positive impacts for them as well, positive impacts on their mental health, positive impacts on their relationship with their children, whether they're with mum or not. You know, that can still be a real benefit. And equally, it has hugely important positive impacts on their children. Just as you've described, having both parents actively involved, and that's regardless of family makeup actually for that matter, but actually does really help to improve those child development outcomes as well. So it can not only support women, it lifts women up in terms of that, you know, not all of that kind of unpaid care responsibility sitting with women. It lifts men up too, and it ultimately can support children's development outcomes longer down the line as well. And I don't know if you want to add anything from your perspective, Imanuel, around that, as to why you think it's important.
Only, I would say, yes, it's definitely the outcome for the children, I think, is the main thing to look at. And the fact that I think society in general seems to think that fathers not really, you know, we don't really care about the children. We don't really, you know, we're more about getting money and going to work and things. But these things do affect fathers emotionally, physically, and mentally, you know. And it is good for men to have that time away, you know. Having a new child is something that really affects everybody in the family. And for these men, sometimes they do want to recover, they want to have that time with their children. And it is, I would say, for mental health and things like that have been mentioned already, it's detrimental, but it's also a benefit to the entire family. So, I just agree with everything that's been said.
And last question from me. Should the government consider wider support for dads alongside or within its review of parental leave? And if so, which aspects of support are key?
Yeah. Sorry, do you want me to come in on that one?
I think everybody can answer that one.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to go. Is that okay if I go first? Yeah, no, hand over. Yeah, I think absolutely yes. I think the benefits of providing wider support, I think if we just purely looked at parental leave reform, which is absolutely crucial and really important, yes. But if we only looked at it through that lens, and rather than thinking about that kind of inclusive whole family lens as well, better support for involved fathers, better support, as I've said, has positive outcomes for women, and it also has positive outcomes for their babies and children as well. So I think some of the other things that I would certainly advocate for, and across the 5 Better Start sites, are things like better mental health provision for both maternal and paternal. Fathers and partners are also quite likely to develop mental health challenges during this time, especially if there's been, for example, a traumatic birth. They may have watched their partner have to go through a C-section or potentially, life-threatening situations, and that has a big impact on them as well. And in Blackpool, a Better Start site, they've actually set up a local dads group that's been very much focused around kind of their improving their physical, emotional and social mental health, and that kind of brotherhood of support for men, and it's been very much driven by men and led by them as well. I think what we've found through our work in A Better Start as well, as I touched on, is there's more work to be done around making existing universal services far more inclusive for fathers, male carers and parents as well. Supporting fathers supports mothers and or partners and women through that whole family approach. And some of the other things that we've seen is it's a real key opportunity, and I know this is about women and equalities, but it's also a real key opportunity to get to men, because this is a real golden moment in their lives. It's a key teachable moment. It's a point in time when a lot of men are really open to having extra support, accessing, thinking about their own health, stopping smoking, improving their diet, thinking about exercising more, because they want to be the best version of themselves for their children and for their family. So we actually did a survey in Nottingham of just over 70 dads, and 80% said they would welcome more support in that antenatal period and in the first 1,001 days. And it was really crucial for them because they wanted to be positive partner, know how to support their partner going through pregnancy and after the birth, but also they wanted to be a positive influence for their children as well. And I do think we need to do more research in this area. There's not as much research around fathers' mental health and how it affects men. And I do think there's a lot more that we can do, though, to think about making services more inclusive and accessible in that time period alongside the parental leave reforms, which are, obviously significant.
I have nothing to add. I think you've summed that up beautifully, Karla.
Thank you, Gemma.
You.
Absolutely.
You.
Thank you, Samantha. And before I hand over to Rachel, Karla, you said about making services more inclusive. Could you explain what that would look like in black and white, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've got some really good examples of what we've done across the 5 Better Start sites about thinking around how we, in particular, improve our access and acceptability for families. And that's, as I said, we've had a real focus on fathers in the Better Start sites, but also on underserved communities. So thinking about Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, migrant populations, people who might have no recourse to public funds as well. So I would say that the key ingredients that we've discovered through the Better Start 5 sites learning is about how we maybe engage better with those underserved and underrepresented groups. So to some extent, one of the key things, which won't come as a great surprise, is relationships are absolutely key. In terms of the relationships you may have with your health professional and or your care professional at that time, making sure that you feel that services are trusted, that they're going to take the time to listen to you, that they're going to even just acknowledge that you're in the room for fathers potentially, and that they can then help reduce some of that stigma, potentially fear, or feeling just judged as to why you're there and asking for help and support. As I said, Blackpool have developed the football therapy sessions, Bradford have done things around woodworking. I think it's really important that if we want to make services more inclusive, we need to involve the people who are providing the services in the design of those services. So we've done a lot of work around co-producing the services in a better start. It's been a core principle of the work that we've done. So working with either dads or those excluded, marginalised groups to say what works for you. Where do you want your service to be? Who do you want to deliver your service? What time should the service be? What kind of environment? What does it look like for you? And getting that first-hand lived experience, helping to shape a service, will make it more accessible, it will make it more acceptable, and we've seen that across all 5 Better Start sites. And I think we need to, as professionals working with families, really think about what are our barriers. We often talk about people being hard to reach or hard to engage. I would actually flip that on the head and just say we're not doing a very good job of engaging with them in the first place. And some of the things that have worked across the Better Start sites have thinking about, especially for maybe people with English as an additional language, are we translating? Are we translating effectively? Are we doing it well? Are we thinking about use of interpreters? Are our services culturally competent and sensitive as well? Are they trauma informed? Do we work through and with trusted voluntary sector community organisations, which is where that community might have more trust? And another key part for us has been trying to think about how we have a more diverse and representative workforce as well, especially if you're thinking about engaging with dads and or black or Asian minority ethnic groups, you know, whether that be males and or females. Having a workforce that better represents the people that they're working with has absolutely paid dividends. Got an example of that in Nottingham with the Family Mentor Service, where we deliberately recruited from the community. So in one area of the city, we had a service that was staffed with a paid peer workforce. They spoke 15 different languages and closely matched the demographic of the city as well. And in Blackpool and in other areas, they've looked at male workers for dad services. Not everyone wants that, but in some areas they've gone, yes, that is what we want. We want a man as leading the service. And I think crucially, we need to improve the data that we collect on some of these groups and around particularly maybe fathers and marginalised groups. Lambeth have done some excellent work around kind of that noting ethnic minority status as other and therefore not really understanding what that means, and they've kind of done some deep dive into that and really looked at kind of what do we mean by that, what actually is the ethnic origin of that family, how does that play out into how they will receive services, how they will accept services, what more do we need to do to understand. So I think there's still a lot of additional work that we can do around making things more inclusive.
Thank you. Imanuel, you've used the Better Start sites, right?
Yes.
What did you like about them?
Yes, so I accessed it through a group named Shifting Your Mindset, and they do a dad's group that meets regularly. So that's how I was introduced to that group and learned wider about, you know, what was behind it from there. Just having the ability to speak, I'm kind of getting on now a little bit, and growing up and being a father, I never felt there was anywhere where I could express certain things that I was going through, things that I thought were very unique to me that I later found out is not unique to me at all. It's quite common. There's a lot of men that feel isolated and feel like they're going through things that even their next door neighbour might be going through the same thing, but nobody's talking. So having a place, a safe space to talk, brilliant. It's just, you know, you're not alone. And, you know, there are situations, just as was mentioned earlier, I think if that, I don't know the situation you spoke about in full, but possibly if that man, you know, had more to talk about, more to talk to, and access to services, it would have likely helped. You know, when my older children were quite young, I was going through what I would now call, you know, postpartum depression. But when I mentioned that, I was laughed at because the idea was men can't go through that. Now it's acceptable that they can, but at the time, really, I only said it to one person and I was laughed at and I didn't mention it again. So just, I would say in terms of services as well, just to tag on what was said in the last question, you know, there are quite rightly maternity services. Women are checked on when the children are young. I think as part of that as well, it would be good to, how's the father? You know, are you okay if he's around, if he's in the house, or even if not? You know, just to find out, because sometimes a young father might need some direction and need some help, and these are the kind of things we talk about. So as a group, what we do is we support each other with our own experiences, and at least there's somewhere we can go. But I think it would be great if there was a wider network to tap into and resources we can tap into so that we can direct people and say, actually, you can go to this place and you can talk about that and get support about that same thing. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
But thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Rachel now. Thank you.
Thank you. Joeli, I know you haven't sort of come in yet, so I'll direct this question to you, but then if other people do feel they want to come in, that's fine. Should the government's objective be to include all working parents in the parental leave system, regardless of their employment status and income?
The Yes, I mean, I think all parents should have access to some form of parental leave, no matter how they become a parent. I think the principles on which parental leave policy should be developed are, firstly, that all parents have access to some form of paid parental leave so that they're enabled to take time off and spend quality time with their child. We know that if they're enabled to do that, that reduces the infant mortality rate, as well as having lots of benefits for the mental health of parents and for the health of the baby. We'd also want to see that the birthing parent has additional time off because, of course, they're giving birth and they can, of course, have birth trauma and all sorts of stuff can happen whilst giving birth. And special consideration should be given to single parents and parents who have multiple births. One simple thing that the government can do is to encourage companies to publish their parental leave policies, which will give parents more choice and information about employers that they want to work for.
Thank you. And do you think there are currently excluded groups that need to be considered in the government's review? Perhaps Alex?
Yes, definitely. So self-employed people are a major group. They have exactly the same needs around the time that a child is born as people who are employed, but many can't afford to take any leave at all. We did some work with a group called On the Tools, who polled tradespeople and found that a third didn't take a single day of leave when their child was born because they just couldn't afford it. And 50% of them said they felt unsafe back at work, big power tools, doing dangerous work on no sleep. So self-employed people are paying in 1.1 billion, self-employed dads paying 1.1 billion in national insurance contributions a year, dwarfs what the government spends on paternity leave, but they get no access to it themselves. So self-employed parents are one crucial group. Single parents, I think Joeli is absolutely right. In other countries, it is common for single parents to get the paternity leave allowance as well as a maternity leave allowance, or to be able to transfer it to a friend or family member. And finally, there are also kinship carers who take on grandparents, for example, who might take on guardianship of their grandchildren, who in effect are taking on many of the responsibilities of an adoptive parent, but get none of the access to leave or support that adoptive parents do. So they should be included as well.
Can I add to that? There's also those on 0-hour contracts and students who are excluded. And also, we've talked about self-employed dads, but we should also talk about self-employed mums who don't get that first 6 weeks at 90% of their salary. They go straight to £182 a week, which is not enough money to live on. So Resolution Foundation did some research and found that self-employed mothers took around 3 to 6 weeks off after childbirth, compared to 9 to 12 months, of course, taken by employed mothers. And we hear from self-employed mothers all the time that they just are not able to stop working. Yet, they're told if they have a C-section, they should be resting for 6 weeks. So it's causing massive problems for mothers as well. And we are actually really rare not having an offer for self-employed dads. If you look at 27 EU countries, there are only 3 that don't offer, plus us, that don't offer paid leave for self-employed dads. The others are Greece, Cyprus and the Netherlands. That was researched by Parental Pay Equality.
Thank you. And Karla, to what extent do you think low take-up rates of parental leave by dads, particularly in groups like working class dad and some minority ethnic groups, are driven by cultural factors?
I think there is, it definitely plays a part without a doubt, as I've sort of already touched on in that previous question, because I think that if people are not aware of what's available and they don't feel it's for them and they're not able to access it, affordability is without a doubt probably one of the largest reasons why people aren't taking up what's available and on offer to them as well. But I think for families who are living in poverty, as Joeli and Alex have touched on, what your employment status is, whether you're on 0 hours, self-employed, part-time working, that perpetuation around the gender stereotypes that we sadly do still see in some parts of society will have an impact on that. But I think, as I've mentioned, the importance of making sure that families and dads, and particularly some of the ethnic minority groups, are aware of what's available, will support that in terms of increasing take-up. And I think that's where they better start learning that I've mentioned around relationships being key, co-producing with fathers and with groups, looking to actively remove those barriers, will really support the improvement of take-up. And that's what we've certainly seen in the 9-10 years of A Better Start, is when we actively seek out to work with groups that are underrepresented, underserved. I would say that the same principles could therefore apply around parental leave. If we ask more questions of people who are on part-time, 0-hours contracts, more time who are self-employed, what would work for you, we're far better and more likely to get a fairer, better system that works for all.
Can you tell us about some of the work you've done specifically to break down cultural barriers?
I think some of the work that we've done has included things like specific groups that have been aimed at particular communities. As I said, the work around translation. So in Nottingham, I can give an example where we've got a front-facing website that's for families to access. We made sure that we translated that website into the 5 core key languages that were spoken in the city. And we also made sure not to just kind of use Google Translate. We actually had it done really well. So for Arabic languages, it flipped the entire site, so they read left to right, right to, that whole thing was thought about. We've also really focused on when we're delivering services. We use a lot of metaphors in English language. It's quite a common thing. I'm horrendously terrible at constantly using metaphors and then suddenly thinking about, and we use a lot of them in child development as well. We talk about babies' brains and how they develop. Metaphors can just not land with someone who's necessarily got English as an additional language, or culturally they don't quite know what that means, or why would you use that metaphor to describe something as well. So we've been really mindful of that. I think developing services that, as Imanuel has talked about, that have been run by voluntary community groups who understand that community really well. They're already trusted, they're working there, they know and understand what the community needs and how we can support them. And that's been really key as well, to kind of not just use your statutory services. They're really important, your health visitors, maternity, family support workers, etc. But really looking at what else is available, what are the strengths and assets within that community, and who are the people that those people trust. And we've learned a lot as well around breaking down some of the engagement barriers there.
Can I just add to that a little bit?
Sure, yeah, please do.
Because I think another reason why there might be a lack of uptake is we could look at the model. When we think about paternity leave, there's a reason why it's the way it is. If a woman's given birth, obviously it's very physically stressful to the body, and rest is needed. The child needs to be suckled and all that. So and weaning, and so a good amount of time is needed. Solid time for her to bond with the child and to feed the child for. If we were to look at paternity leave, it might not be needed for the exact same reasons. So it would be needed for the father to bond with the child and, to support the mother and to empathise. But it could be that instead of taking a solid, so many weeks off, he could take 1 or 2 days a week off, and just have that time with the family and still be able to work. I think for some guys, their identity is very much into the work. They think about, getting paid, the whole camaraderie around work. And so a bit of both might be help guys to think, okay, then yes, I will take that time off to be with the family and still be able to have my work routine. So that's just a thought of how we could look at it.
Thank you. And Alex, do you have any data on the background of men and dads who are supporting your campaign for improved paternity leave?
Yeah, we have a big survey which thousands of parents have filled in, and we see across there people from basically every background. A lot of teachers, we have people who work in business, we have people who work in the charity sector, we have tradespeople, plumbers, builders, we have all sorts of careers and backgrounds, and it's people spread across the country. One thing I'd like to add on the question around the barriers to uptake, I think it is hard to overstate how big a barrier pay is. Mm-hmm. And if you look at Spain, it's a really instructive example on this. So 7 or 8 years ago, their paternity leave was as bad as ours almost. They had 2 weeks, and they've gone through a phased process of increasing it by a couple of weeks at a time for a few years. So now you get 16 weeks at 100% pay. And the 100% pay is crucial because what they found is that the uptake rate across people, across all different industries, is incredibly high. It's 15 to 16 weeks on average if you work in manufacturing or whether you work in business or whether you work in finance or science or agriculture. It's pretty universal. And I think that speaks to the fact that if people have to pay to get that time, it creates a barrier that a lot of people are unwilling to cross, or a lot of people really just can't cross. And at the moment, if you're on an average salary, it costs over £1,000 to take your 2 weeks of paternity leave. And that's an amount of money that a lot of people just cannot afford.
Thank you. Do you think there's an appetite for change across all the range of occupational income groups?
Yes, definitely. I mean, going back to the polling I spoke of earlier, we have support across all sorts of income brackets. In fact, you often see some of the support is highest amongst people in lowest income brackets for getting that opportunity to be more actively involved in their family. And you're as likely to agree with that if you're a Labour voter or a Reform voter or a Conservative voter. It's pretty universal.
Yeah. We did polling that found very similar outcomes as what your polling did. So we have 2 polls saying the same thing. We also did some research which found that half of dads and second parents who don't take their full allocation of paternity leave said the reason was financial hardship. And the men tend to take 2 weeks until they tip over a household income of £150,000, and then they can take up to 9 weeks. But before £150,000, they're taking 2 weeks or less. But the other barrier, of course, is employment. So we know that men often are pressured to come back to work before that 2 weeks is up. And we found that 17% of dads said their employer was putting pressure on them to return early, which is why they did, while an additional 13% said that they were worried that they wouldn't get the promotion they were hoping for if they didn't go back earlier than the 2 weeks. So I'd say it's money, culture, employment are the issues.
I'll come back to you, Alex. So you don't think that this idea that seems to be putting forward that parental leave is somehow just playing into a woke agenda is something that...
No, not at all. There's widespread support for it. Our attitudes have changed. Our problem is that our systems, our policies have not, and we are decades behind other countries on this.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel. Alex had some follow-up questions.
Sorry, it's to my next...
The next one. Okay, that's absolutely fine. Kiris, I'll come to you now.
Thank you, Chair. And it's really, really nice to see you all here. Thank you so much for coming to share some of your insights. So I'm an active supporter of the Pregnant and Screwed campaign, so I'm really pleased to see you, Joeli. And I'm actively involved in the Dad Shift campaign. I must also declare that I'm an officer of the Women in Work APPG and the Women's Health APPG. So now that I've got that out of the way. So Alex and Joeli, you're both calling for a longer period of statutory paternity leave. In your view, what length of paternity leave would be feasible right now?
Yeah, 6 weeks at 90% of salary, and it's got to be at a high percentage of salary, is the absolute minimum that we should be offering dads, and I think and second parents, and I think it is absolutely feasible for us to offer that. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation looked at the cost, and they estimated that it would be £1.73 billion based on a 70% take-up rate. I don't expect the take-up rate to be that high immediately. I think it would take about 5 years to get there. But they also said that it would have an economic benefit of £2.6 billion. I know that you're speaking to them next, so I'm sure they'll share all that research with you. Look, I think it's time we asked ourselves a fundamental question about what sort of society we want this to be. Do we want to continue to perpetuate outdated and harmful gender stereotypes that tell us it is women that do the nurturing and the caring and the child rearing and are the homemakers, whereas men just need to pull their socks up, get back to work. They are the strong, stoic breadwinners, and that they don't need this time to nurture and care for their family. You know, the mental health of men in this country is in crisis. Boys are saying that they feel lost and disconnected, and it's no wonder when our laws are literally telling them you don't need time to nurture and to connect with your family. Bronnie Ware, the palliative care nurse, wrote a book about her experience of caring for the dying, and she said that every man on his deathbed said, I wish I had spent more time with my children and I had cared and I had worked less. You know, these aren't just words, these are the wishes of men on their deathbed, and we are still not listening. It is absolutely imperative that if we care about the well-being of women, of men, of parents, of children, then we make a change. And the only way that change is going to happen, we have got companies that are trying desperately to bridge that gap, but it's only affecting a small group of men. The only way that change is going to happen is if this government do something and they increase paternity leave, ring fence it and pay it at a decent percentage of salary.
Alex, do you want to add anything?
I mean, I think that's bang on. 6 weeks, 90% would be transformative to where we are now, but is the bare minimum. It would still put us in the bottom third in Europe. It shouldn't be the end point, but it would make a huge difference.
Thank you. And do you see that as a first step towards more equal parental leave for fathers and other parents?
I think I think that should be the goal, yeah. And if you look at countries who are doing this really well, example you can spoken to about a lot is Sweden, where both parents, they have this combination of ring fence leave for both parents, again properly paid, so each parent gets 90 days. And then on top of that, they can share 300 days between them. And what's really important is that you have that ring fenced element. It's not just share parental leave for all, work it out yourselves. That's been tried in the past, that doesn't work. What you see time and time again is that dads will sacrifice that leave so that mothers can take all of it. What you need is the ring fence leave and then building shared parental leave on top of that. That would be an ideal end situation. Sweden have been at this for 50 years, and we're not assuming we're going to get to that overnight. And what we really need to start with is better, longer paid paternity leave. That has to be the priority, not tweaking shared parental leave, which has fundamentally failed as a policy. We did some research in December on the 10th anniversary of shared parental leave. Less than 2% of people are taking it, and the uptake is vastly unequal. It's essentially only accessible to the very wealthiest people. 60% of people who take it are in the top 20% of incomes. More people take it in London than Scotland, Wales, the North East, North West and Northern Ireland combined. And the problems are that it's not well enough paid, and people are still reluctant because dads don't have their own decent paternity leave allowance. They're reluctant to take that away from mothers. And so if we try and tweak that, we're not going to get anywhere. We have to start with better paternity leave.
Yeah, and that's got to be the sort of basic starting point, hasn't it?
That's right, yeah.
Thank you. And Joeli, your mission is to tackle pregnancy and maternity discrimination, and rightly so. To what extent could a reformed parental leave system work towards this end?
So pregnancy and maternity discrimination exists because we have this intrinsic bias, employers do, towards women. This is well documented, I'm not just saying this, where we see women as distracted and less committed to their jobs from the point that they get pregnant. We see them as a burden to business because they're going to take time off to look after that baby. And so if we make parental leave gender neutral so that dads are taking longer periods of time out of work, then that bias will also shift towards men as well. And of course, as an employee, you can't have a bias towards everybody that is your potential employee. So it will change things, absolutely, and it will reduce pregnancy and maternity discrimination. You look at countries who have better paternity leave systems where dads are taking longer periods of time out of work, you have much lower rates of pregnancy and maternity discrimination. But it will also have a positive impact on the mental health of mums, and that is crucial here because lots of women return to work after having a baby and they have quite severe postnatal depression still. They're still not ready to return to work, and it is really well documented that if dads and second parents are enabled to take that time out to spend time with the whole family, the mental health of women improves dramatically. So we know that this will reduce the motherhood penalty. And our research with the Centre for Progressive Policy found that countries that have at least 6 weeks paternity leave paid at 90% of salary have a 4% smaller gender pay gap and a 3.7% smaller labour force participation gap. So you get more women in work and they progress much faster as a result.
Thank you, that's great. And do you think extending paternity leave, do you think that would require more focus on tackling parental discrimination affecting men? And would you support better legal protections for men alongside a reform in the parental leave system?
Yeah, absolutely. We know that if men ask to take shared parental leave, they also can encounter bias and discrimination as a result. We've heard some shocking stories from men, employers saying, shall I buy you a dress while you're at it, or writing emails to them that entitled hello nanny, all sorts of awful messages, gendered messages to men. The law obviously changed in April, so you have extended protection from redundancy when you're pregnant and when you return from parental leave, and that works for men only if they're taking shared parental leave. So if we're extending paternity, we would also need to change the law so that when they return, they're not discriminated against.
Okay, thanks. Alex, Karla,
Yeah.
Imanuel, did you want to...
I'd add to that, I completely agree with that. We should extend that protection to paternity leave as well. And we've heard actually quite a surprisingly high number of stories from dads who have applied for paternity leave and then HR have gone silent for a few weeks and then they've lost their jobs, or they've lost their jobs. We heard from someone who lost a job on his third day of paternity leave whilst his child was lying on his chest, and his heart rate went up so much that it woke up his child, and it's been devastating for him and his family. I don't think the scale of it is the same scale of what mothers face, but it is there, and we absolutely need better protection for men and other non-birthing parents taking paternity leave from discrimination and dismissal.
Yeah. No, I would absolutely agree. And I mean, I've obviously talked about some of the, what I would consider the great work that the A Better Start sites have done, because we've had that fabulous opportunity through the lottery grant to really try and test and learn new things. But until there are some significant changes, as Alex and Joeli have highlighted in the first instance, yes, we've made great strides forward in terms of access and accessibility, and breaking down barriers, but it's still there. It's still a real thing. And I think it's interesting to talk about employers, because equally we've seen, and I don't think, again, this is necessarily a deliberate thing, but we've seen quite a lot of fathers facing bias from people who work in those services that are there. So maternity, for example, we've run a fabulous project in Nottingham, but it's been really hard work in terms of a culture shift around midwifery, 0 to 19, our health visitors. We actually looked at how we could improve making things more father inclusive and partner inclusive in the maternity space, and we agreed to fund 144 recliner chairs across our two hospital trusts, our hospital trusts across their two sites, in Nottingham City. At the time of us proposing that, fully funded by the A Better Start grant, only 7% of the workforce were supportive. They came up with a huge range of reasons, mainly linked to safeguarding and other things like that, negative connotations around fathers as to why that wasn't a good idea. 70% of women and pregnant people were in favour. We decided to press ahead with it. After we'd been running it for just over a year, 85% of women and pregnant people who then used that and their partners said that they felt better supported during pregnancy because their partner was with them. So there was a huge shift. Women were already saying, we want this. The workforce were going, oh, we can't do that. And then actually it was a huge success, and it really changed hearts and minds as well. I need to stress that around colleagues in maternity in Nottingham. They had a huge shift to the point where the Integrated Care Board locally also funded the rollout across the other hospital trust up in Mansfield and Sherwood as well. So there's a lot to do as well with workforce that then support in pregnancy alongside as well employers.
Did you want to add anything?
I have nothing more to add.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks.
It's curious. Catherine.
Thank you. Just a quick supplementary question to Kira's excellent questions there, and thank you all for coming, and it's really great. Joeli, I'm a big fan of your work. I used to be CEO of Women's Equality Network Wales, and we often quoted your research. So thank you very much.
I think what I'd like to understand then is, are we, to me, the end goal needs to be completely equalised parental leave. Am I right? And I just would like you to talk a little bit about that, and probably Joeli. As in, it needs to not be shared. It needs to be exactly the same rights for men and women, or two parents, because otherwise we're going to continue with gender inequality and the gender pay gap.
You would also need to add on a period of time for women giving birth, because of course, it can be quite an ordeal. Yeah. But yes, besides that, yes, I think you equalise parental leave. But the key thing is ring fencing it, having it on a use it or lose it basis, and paying it at a decent percentage of salary. But yeah, of course, we'd love to be in the position that Sweden are in, or any of the Nordic countries. We just appreciate that it's going to take a little bit of time to get there.
We take the steps now to get to that in the end. Thank you. That was the only question.
Thank you, Catherine. Alex.
Thank you. I think it speaks volumes that you're saying that men are fearful of the same kind of discrimination that women have been experiencing for generations on this topic. I feel like that's exactly the point. Alex, if I can start with you. The dad shift says evidence is clear that shared parental leave can't on its own drive gender equality in parenting. Can you talk a little bit about why you've come to that view?
Sure. So if you can look at other countries, some of the Scandinavian countries started with shared parental leave as an option. So Norway, for example, introduced it back in the 70s and gave dads the right to take shared parental leave in 1978, I think it was. And by 1993, only 3% of men were taking any parental leave at all. And that's because you come up against those cultural barriers that say this is really time for mothers, it's not something that fathers do. And those practical barriers and those cultural barriers feed into each other. So no one's taking a leave, so the culture doesn't change. So no one takes a leave, so the culture doesn't change. They then introduced paternity leave, ring-fence paternity leave, the first country in the world to do the daddy quota, as they called it. And overnight, that went from 3 to 30%. And within 7 years, it was 70%. Today, it's at 95%. And that you see that time and time again from other countries, that the leap has been made in men taking leave, and subsequently the leap has been made in attitudes around parenting roles, men taking on a bigger role in childcare, and the shift towards gender equality that we want to see. That comes after proper, well-paid ring-fence leave for dads, and not from shared parental leave as a starting point.
Thank you. A lot of the reasons people give for not taking this up are things like affordability and the application process. Do you think that simplifying the eligibility criteria, increasing the rate of statutory pay, would contribute to some substantial change? And if not, why not?
I think it would help. I think the challenge you're going to find is that statutory pay is so low at the moment that if you increased it to a level that made it accessible for the vast majority of people, you would end up in situations where some people could take 33 weeks of shared parental leave at 100% pay on government statutory rates, which it creates its own problems, right? So I think it could do, but it's quite a badly designed system. And Joeli is far more an expert on this than I am, but we're unusual in having a very long maternity leave that's very poorly paid, and a very short paternity leave, which is also very poorly paid. And we've kind of dug ourselves into a bit of a hole that makes it actually quite hard to tweak shared parental leave to make it work in that context. So it might help, but really it feels like a red herring, and there's a much more simple, proven, easier to implement solution, which is improving paternity leave.
And do you think that families are finding men taking parental leave harder than women taking it, in part because of a pre-existing gender pay gap?
Yes, I think that's the case. And for example, one of the stories that we submitted was from a guy called Andrew who said that he was really pumped to be super active when his child was born. They planned to take shared parental leave, and then they sit down and did the numbers, and said, well, this is going to cost us thousands of pounds. And that's both partly because he earned more than his partner, but also because enhanced maternity leave is still much more common than enhanced paternity leave. So the main issue there is that his partner would lose her enhanced maternity leave if he took shared parental leave, so she wouldn't get the full pay for that time. He would just get statutory rates, and so it's completely unaffordable.
You would then have a double whammy actually as well.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add on that?
I mean, when you're making decisions as a family as to what makes the most sense, in a heterosexual couple, it is more likely the man earns the most money, and so it doesn't make sense for him to take a step back from earning when one of you's got to drop down to £182 a week. So, yes, it definitely makes a difference.
Thank you. Okay. And to everyone then, in the long term, should the UK, I think we've probably covered this already, but should the UK be looking to emulate some of the most generous paternity leave systems in Europe?
Yes.
Yes, great.
Fine. Do you think the government should consider changes to maternity entitlements, for instance, capping the first 6 weeks of maternity pay to make those necessary reforms more affordable?
I'm going to try and say this calmly,
but
absolutely not. As Alex has said, we have a generous system in terms of time. We do not have a generous system in terms of pay. We are in the bottom 10 of the OECD countries in terms of maternity benefit. That was researched by UNICEF. You know, I mean, our whole parental leave system doesn't work, and the worst part of it is paternity leave, which is why there's such a big push at the moment to change that, because it's so bad and we're so behind other countries on this. But our maternity leave system is also very poor. And so hacking away at an already inadequate system absolutely is not the right answer. And we have a really low birth rate in the UK. You know, out of the G7 countries, we have the lowest birth rate, which is a massive problem for our future. And we know that good parental leave policies encourage parents to have babies. If you suddenly start taking maternity leave away from women, what do you think is going to happen? They're going to stop having babies and we're all going to be in a mess. So no, do not do that, please.
Anyone else?
I mean, one thing I'd add to that is you know, this is relevant to the question earlier about why is the asked 6 weeks at 90%. It's because that is what mums get before they drop down to statutory rates. And it's very hard to argue that dads and other non-birthing parents should get higher pay than mothers would. So really we're kind of capped at 6 weeks, 90% until we look at improving maternity pay as well. And really we need to make advances on both sides of the coin in order to benefit this for everyone.
76% of mothers have had to rely on some form of debt to get through maternity leave, and 4 in 10 mothers have taken just 12 weeks or less maternity leave because the pay is so poor.
I'm not an expert here, but I'm just a dad, so I don't know how practical this is, but I know that there is a lot of money put into subsidising childcare, and I think, as been said, the whole system needs to just be looked at and revamped, maybe rethought. And as part of that, the question could be, how can we get fathers to be able to help more as well? That might lessen the pressure for childcare, because that's a lot of money. When you think about it, you have strangers looking after their children when the parents would love to but can't afford to.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that could be looked at, and even just things like, again, tweaking, allowing for the leaving earlier to help and to support with school runs, things like that. Again, I don't know how this would work in practicality for policy, but it's something that I feel would be taken up by your ordinary person that just wants to find a way to be more involved in their family life.
Thank you. I've got one more question, if I may. Alex, I'm going to come back to you. You've talked about cultural changes that are needed to help drive uptake in paternal leave. Do you think the changes that we've talked about in terms of ring-fenced leave and a higher rate of pay, would that be sufficient to drive those cultural changes, or are there other things that we need to look at, either in our legal system or culturally, to help push that?
I think it's a big step. Alone, it's not going to be the single silver bullet. And I think paternity leave it's part of a web of factors that make it hard, that basically drive people towards traditional gender roles, whether or not that's what they want. It drive men to become the single primary breadwinner, mean that mums end up as the single caregiver and in charge of the home. The other two big ones are the cost of childcare and poor options around flexible working, because essentially it's, if you can't juggle work around picking up the kids from school, one parent has to take a step back from work, or if childcare, to have 2 kids in childcare costs you £3,000 a month, which is more than most people earn, then it doesn't make sense for both parents to work. One has to step back. And so we have to tackle these other areas that put up barriers to both parents being actively involved in looking after their kids. So paternity leave is a major one, but it's not the only one.
Anyone else got any thoughts on that?
We just know that other countries that do ring-fence paternity leave and pay it at a decent percentage of salary have a smaller unpaid labour gap. So in other words, men do more in the home. They do more of the cooking, cleaning, sock pairing, childcare over the lifetime of that child. And so it is a trigger for changing the culture, not only in society and in workplaces, but in the home, and that's vital.
I think from our work we've acknowledged that yes, that would be a huge step forward, but what we also need to do is make sure that after baby arrives, or even before baby arrives in that antenatal the postnatal period, we need to make sure that our systems and our services, like I touched on, those universal services, are there to support families and not be purely focused on mum and or there's a real balance there, because obviously there needs to be support for mum, quite rightly. She's the one who's potentially, has given birth, but they need to be more inclusive of fathers as well. They need to be welcoming. They need to be safe spaces for dads to go. And I think, as I've touched on, that you could do that in a couple of different ways, and that's certainly what the Better Starts of Sites have looked at. We've looked at how do we create more inclusive services that welcome fathers, male carers and partners into those, and or do we look at bespoke services for fathers? And certainly in Southend they've done a particular piece of work around men's mental health in the kind of postnatal period and the perinatal mental period, and they've very much taken that think family approach, in terms of not seeing fathers as an add-on, but seeing them as individuals who are equally in need of help potentially, and that's been really crucial. So I think there is something around, yes, the leave's the first step forward, and having that protection around that is really important. But then the support services and the networks and the structures that are there, do they then enable fathers and partners to feel included as well, and are they accessible for them?
Thank you, Alex. I just wanted to dig down a bit more onto the cultural aspects of what we need to see to change this. It's not just, I think, the offer of parental leave, it's also about how we as a society see what role fathers play. I know it's some time ago, but we have commentators like Piers Morgan laughing and mocking people like Daniel Craig for being an active parent and holding their baby in a baby carrier. How do we challenge those kind of traditional ideas, not just from a legal perspective in terms of workers' rights, but from a cultural one as well? Alex, I wanted to come to you.
Yes, I remember that. I mean, to be honest, I'll take my cues on masculinity from James Bond, not Piers Morgan.
I think that's probably why.
I think so. There's a lot of different ways to subdivide this question. There's no simple answer, of course. I think what we see this as part of, there is increasingly worrying evidence that particularly a lot of young men are being drawn towards far-right ideas around what masculinity means. We saw that recently in the German elections, where men under 25 were more likely than the population as a whole to vote for the AfD, for the far right. And the crisis in masculinity is a kind of overused phrase, but it reflects something real, that the role of men in society has changed over the last 30, 40 years as the role of women have expanded into the workforce, which is a really good thing. We have not done the work as a society to expand the role of men back the other way. And that is creating a vacuum that is being filled by some pretty toxic ideas around how you find status as a man. And we think that fights like improving paternity leave that are coalitional between men and women, that benefit both men and women, are part of how we say, look, this is an alternative idea about how you can be happy and fulfilled as a man in the 21st century, that hopefully starts to push back on some of those other ideas.
Thanks, Alex. Imanuel, you're kind of nodding along to that. Have you got anything you want to add on it?
Yeah, I would just say that, Piers Morgan, okay, not many people really follow him, just like Alex just said. I would say listen to the everyday man. The majority of the people we don't hear from is just your everyday people who their main focus is their family. And so in terms of stereotypes and that kind of thing, they don't really care, they're more interested in how can they support their family, and not just financially, but they want to spend time with children, with their partners. And so if we was to give more of a voice to that and normalize that voice, I think then people would know that that's just what it is. Piers Morgan, he has a platform and he can say whatever he has to say, but people will choose to ignore majority of that, if you ask me. So I would say that, and I would say I was just actually it just left my mind. I was just writing something down as you said it. I will leave that point. I'll leave that point if it comes back to me.
Yes, Joeli, because I think it kind of lends itself as well into what we're seeing. We're not immune to what happens in America, and there is an increasing presence there around, I would say, that conversation around toxic masculinity that Alex talked about, but also the rising popularity or glamorization of the trad wife traditions. Yeah, and that's what I meant by, in terms of the cultural kind of aspect, we could give all of the workers' rights that we would want to see in that shared parental leave and the improvements, but if we're culturally not seeing that take-up, and you said 70% is estimated to be the take-up, and actually that would probably be an overestimation of where we are right now currently, because culturally and societally we're not there yet.
No, but I think, if you look at what has happened in Sweden, it's taken a number of years for that take-up to increase. You have to start somewhere, and I do think the law needs to lead the way on this. I have a podcast on raising boys and masculinity called To Be a Boy, if anybody wants to tune in. And we talk about this a lot, and I think what's happened in the strive for gender equality is we've asked girls to be more like boys and boys to continue to be boys. So we've said to girls, be strong, be a warrior, you can do anything, you can be a computer programmer, a scientist, whatever you want to be. We haven't said to boys, you can be nurses, you can be stay-at-home dads, you can be really, really great fathers. What sort of dad do you want to be? And I think the education system could play a role in this, in talking to men more about care, connection, and the things that truly matter to us as humans, because, men have everything. They have everything except the thing that truly matters, and that's connection and bonding and an ability and freedom to be able to talk about their feelings and express themselves. And so I think that starts at a very young age, and we all have a role to play in changing that narrative for men and boys.
Thank you, Joeli. Alex has got a quick supplementary.
Very quick follow-up to that. I think you're absolutely right in terms of that conversation. Is there an element there that to be feminine, traditionally, whatever that looks like, and all the stereotypes of caring and so on, is seen by our society as less than, generally, reflected in pay gap, reflected in those discriminations? And if so, how do we start to tackle that, which might be slightly out the scope of shared parental leave, but how can this help?
Yes, I mean, it absolutely is. This is sexism, and feminine coded things are devalued constantly. And I think we changed that. The way that we've changed girls, and the fact that they felt that they had to go into certain jobs, or the fact that they felt they had to be stay-at-home parents, or that they were weak or lesser than, is by sending these messages constantly that you're not, you are strong, you are powerful, you can be whatever you want to be. We now need to do that for boys because we've forgotten about boys, and we're not saying to them things that I've just articulated, nurture, care. You can go into female-coded employment, all of that sort of stuff. I think we just need to change. We need to think about that narrative a bit more when we're talking to boys.
Thank you so much for all of your input and your expertise today. I know that all of the committee really appreciate it. Thank you for your time. We're going to switch over panels now. Thank you. And I should say, if there's anything pressing that you think that you weren't able to say or articulate today, please follow it up with written evidence to the committee. Thank you.
I'll have all of the water now. I have all of the water now. I drink so much of it.
Another country where there's not about. Is it? Okay.
Why not? In Iceland, they teach from like nursery age. They get
I use this.
responsibilities.
Right. That's good.
In New Zealand.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can cook up.
Yeah, no, Michael. I've got a meeting with Meg next week.
Yeah.
I think Iceland, yeah, though, but they teach that. In care and role from an early age, and boys are encouraged to do things like beauty and hair and like look after the dolls and those sorts of things.
It's the only way you're going to test it, isn't it? Fine. Pretty young. Yeah.
Hello to our second panel and welcome, and thank you for joining us. I know that you were all listening to the first panel, so thank you. I want to just take some time to introduce the panel. We have Dr. Sarah Forbes, Senior Lecturer at the University of York and Co-Director of Equal Parenting Project. Abby Jitendra, Principal Policy Advisor from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which we've already heard a lot about, some of the research. That would be great to hear some more. Dr. Gemma Mitchell, Associate Professor in Law at the University of East Anglia, welcome, and Jemima Olchawski, Chief Executive Officer from the Fawcett Society. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to Christine.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming along. And I wonder if we could ask, first of all, if we could ask Dr. Forbes. Most witnesses point to the very low take-up of shared parental leave, and some describe it as a failed policy. What would our parental leave system lose, do you think, if we didn't have shared parental leave?
Thank you for that question. It's a very good one. Okay, so one of the things that I'll just start with, we have done research around shared parental leave with users and companies for about 7 years now. Is that me?
No, I don't know.
Okay. Through this, we've identified a number of key barriers to uptake, particularly around pay and eligibility. But there are also 4 key sets of benefits that need to be recognised. The idea of shared parental leave encapsulates the idea that we as a country want to encourage more sharing of care, equal parenting, and move away from gendered assumptions about childcare. 2, shared parental leave offers great flexibility or greater flexibility than any other form of parental leave policy at the moment. It can be used in blocks in different amounts throughout the first year and by any eligible parents. In our research, for example, we saw a lot of dads using paternity leave after their child was born, and SPL actually supported some mums with their return to work because they felt more comfortable leaving their child with the father rather than leaving them with a stranger, is what we were being told in our interviews. Also, women are increasingly using shared parental leave, and it is most likely that this is because of the flexibility it offers. So, third, this is the only means for dads to take longer than 2 weeks paternity leave. And finally, shared parental leave currently is not accessible to all parents, and this really needs to be addressed.
However, we know that many of the women currently using it, who are highly educated, receive higher pay, or have higher pay, and are in dual income families, are relying on the flexibility it offers to support their labour market attachment and help them return to their careers, which helps support other policy areas like the gender pay gap and women on boards. But essentially, if we think about it, any reform that does happen, we have to make sure that we retain the benefits that can be received through this system. So, yeah.
Okay, that actually reflects something I felt at the time with maternity leave. Once we'd finished, my husband and I, because of our careers, were able to arrange flexibility so that he could be there in the first half of the day and I could be there in the second half. That was actually very reassuring. So the fact that what you say about leaving it with the other parent rather than a stranger is really important. I wonder if I could ask the others, though. The Fawcett Society and others say that low take-up of SPL means that it currently doesn't shift the dial very much on equal parenting. But do you believe it could be reformed in a way that would boost take-up and have a greater impact?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're really delighted that the committee is looking into this issue, and women are at a significant disadvantage in our economy, as you've discussed, in terms of pay, access to the most senior roles, and overall earnings. And one of the greatest drivers of that is unequal unpaid care and responsibilities. And one of the most powerful tools we have to address that is shared parental leave. We know that when men take more leave, that supports women's return to work and increases employment rates. And we know that it changes habits in households over the longer term so that the unpaid care and responsibilities are shared more equally. But yeah, the problem is right now it's inaccessible, it's complicated, the levels of remuneration are too low, so that take-up is sort of so low as to have no impact on those things at a broader social level. And in particular, that's the case for lower earning households, households where people are in self-employment or in secure work. And it's important to recognise as well that those are households that are much more likely to have black and minoritised mothers, which contributes to a much larger ethnicity motherhood pay penalty. So it has a lot of potential, but it needs to have proper level rates of pay that make it affordable and accessible for more families and households.
Thank you. More about the others. What would you like to add?
I would just say I agree that it's better than shared parental leave is better than nothing, and so getting rid of it and replacing it with nothing is a bad idea for sure. I would say I think some of the advantages that I'm terrible with this. Sarah identified could also be replicated with some gender-neutral parental leave, with some blocks of non-transferable leave, like the others recommended in the previous panel.
Thank you.
I think I broadly agree. So one of the things that we found at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation before we did this work on paternity leave is that there is something called a caring penalty in the labour market that exists for mothers looking after children. That also exists increasingly for people looking after their spouses or parents. What we would call, for people doing both would be sandwich carers. I think the principle that you mentioned, that caring should be something that is shared, is absolutely right. I don't think there's many people in this room who would disagree with that. However, I think what we've seen on shared parental leave for too long is a sort of acceptance of the completely mediocre take-up rate. And I think it has posed, in some ways, a sort of limit to broader, ambitious changes. So I think I'd really agree with you that, scrapping it entirely with nothing else as a backstop seems, completely silly, because, many people do rely on it, even though we know its limitations. But what we need now, as Joeli said in the previous session, is for this government to really take the reins and do something better, which I'm sure we'll talk about soon.
Thank you. I wondered, and I'm not sure who to, possibly Dr. Forbes first, at what level of take-up do you think SPL would start to have a substantial impact, including on other areas like the pay gap and wider gender equality?
I think this is where I would just bring it back to the family themselves. I would actually just say that amongst the families that we've interviewed and engaged with over the years, it had a tremendous impact. Being able to, I can say that it also had a negative impact on those that did not have access. So whilst we also interviewed those that used the policy, we interviewed those that actually wanted to use it or, actually outlined the barriers that prevented them from using it. Amongst those families, so for example, I spoke to one gentleman and I actually interviewed his wife as well, and he actually was excluded from being able to use shared parental leave. So what that meant for him was he was not able to have any time with his child during the day at all. And he would actually cry and say like he wanted more time with his child. He would come home and the child would be in the crib asleep, so he got no quality time with his child. And essentially that meant that he had 2 weeks and then he was expected to be back at work and he was not able to have that quality time. What it meant for his wife was the fact that she was actually wanting to have him there to support her, and she had nothing. So her family lived far away, so she didn't get that support. So what that meant for her was she was actually going through a very, very difficult time, not being able to have him have longer time. She wanted him to use that time. Amongst the families that were able to use it, I can tell you that they had that quality bonding time together. It made a significant difference for, and this is going to sound really weird, but I had one dad tell me, before he took the leave, he would come home and he'd just be like, what's this? Oh my gosh, everything's like, oh. And then he took extended leave. Not just the 2 weeks at the beginning where everything was just, they weren't even able to develop routines or anything. But when he was able to take that leave later on by himself, that made a huge difference. And do you know what he said? I get it. So, yeah, it can make a huge impact on families.
Dr. Jitendra, I beg your pardon, do you think the wider issues, you can see the same reflection in the wider issues? Like gender pay gap and equality?
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, I think unpaid leave or leave where you can sort of trade off, on your wife's or your partner's leave is positive. We know that it makes some difference in a system where leave is hard to come by in our labour market. It's definitely not a bad thing, but one thing that we've been calling for recently is a real change in the amount that fathers are entitled to automatically. So I'm sure we've heard already that paternity leave in this country is the worst in Europe, and we also know that the worst off families suffer. That means what that actually means on the ground is a lack of choices, women staying home more, lower wages for women that last a very long time, and fundamentally this is a sort of gender issue. It's an equity issue. It's a class issue as well, as others have said. And so, yeah, I think if you want a labour market and a society where we have more gender equality, where we have more gender equity, then I think we need to look not just at leave, but at pay, because it's really those wage differences that sort of work out and sort of, have an exponential impact on the lives of women sort of down the line.
Yeah, can I add that I think there's, maybe there's a kind of a magic threshold that you get to and it creates a tipping point and it creates social change. But in a way, I don't think we need to worry about that too much, because the international evidence makes pretty clear that when you get this right, your take-up rates are massive. So Spain now has equal take-up of parental leave amongst women and men. Quebec changed their system in the early 2000s and 93% of men take that paid leave. When it's there and the system works, you get the change. So right now, we're not anywhere near those kind of levels, but actually it's not kind of impossible to imagine that we can transition to a system where there is just a really big shift in those norms.
I remember, it seems a lifetime ago now, 2015, actually during the general election campaign, being asked by a journalist, but what difference does it make in terms of equality? And I said, well, and this might be controversial, if you are interviewing for a job and you see a woman, you're going to think about, will she be taking maternity leave? if a guy coming in, you know he's going to take paternity leave, then you begin to even out the market. Is that happening? Or does that come back to the question of getting to the crucial point?
I don't think that we could say that that would be likely right now, and we still see very high rates of maternity discrimination against women. And we know that there are bonuses for men in the workplace in terms of pay and esteem, whereas women experience penalties. But I do think that there will be a cultural power in when that risk, quote unquote, to employers is equalised. Then we will see a shift in the treatment, because women and men are as likely to need that time out. And when men are as likely to need flexibility, time out, support to return to work, I think those men in positions of power will start to generate more changes in our workplace that benefit everyone else, because I don't think that they would put up with the situation that the majority of women have to experience right now.
And finally, do you think reform of shared parental leave should be considered alongside the reform of paternity leave in the government's proposed review?
Absolutely. Would really, I really hope that the government does bring forward their review of leave, which has been promised within the first year. Also importantly, the government is really looking to transform childcare, another important part of this puzzle. And our research that looks at where countries have made a big transition internationally, that has been done hand in hand with reviewing parental leave allocations. And if you get those two systems to work effectively together, you can have a bigger impact on childhood outcomes, on equality access to employment and economic growth. So it's really important actually that thinking is done in a joined up way.
Would anybody else like to add anything to that?
Yes, I mean, I completely agree. I think there is something here about transitioning from our current system to the new system, and I think it's only when we actually have, men taking up leave at the same levels as women are, that we're going to see, any of the changes in the labour market, any of the growth benefits, which hopefully we'll get to in a second. But we're just not there yet, because the systems that we've created just don't do a good enough job. Absolutely, let's reform shared parental leave, but let's not make any qualms about the fact that unless we are giving fathers, particularly fathers on a low income, some kind of monetary incentive to actually leave work, they're just not going to do so. And the best evidence we have of that is the system we have now.
Yeah, so just to add though, so we've got a system where we've got a year for maternity leave. Now 39 weeks of that is paid and 2 weeks is paternity leave. We do in this country have some organisations that will be enhancing shared parental leave, but not many. And this is the thing, within those industries there are likely to be professional services sectors, and they probably have some insight into normalising the visibility of fatherhood in the workplace. So, over the years we have gone into organisations and done research to understand what it is that they're doing. They'll have a fathers network, a parenting group that's directly about fathers. They'll have, fatherhood champions. The visibility is there. But again, that's not across the UK. So this is something that's not accessible. The pay is very low. It's £184.03, a week. And essentially, because we have a breadwinner culture in this country where men are the breadwinner, they will actually look at that and say, well, financially, my household would take a hit. My family would take a hit if I was to take that. So they don't take it. So what we have is, currently at the moment, we have, the problem isn't that, the rich are using it, the ones that have higher education, the ones that are, in dual income households. The problem is no one else is using it. So we need to make it so that other people can actually access it. So it's really important that we actually consider reforming shared parental leave, because it's also a means of actually creating cultural change. So like I said before, that's pretty much our only means of extending beyond what would be offered for, paternity leave. So for any father, if there was going to be a 6 weeks paternity leave, shared parental leave would be the only means of actually going beyond that. So, it's really important. It's a huge lever in creating cultural change.
Dr. Mitchell, did you want to add anything?
I don't have too much to add, other obviously I agree that reform would be important. I think that the obvious reform is to replace it with a period of parental leave. And I think also the previous discussion as well, listening to the panel, highlights the issues we have around the terminology as well here. So we need to start again and get rid of the gendered language around maternity, paternity, and it needs to be updated to be much more inclusive of all the families that are welcoming children. But yes, to me, the obvious reform in terms of benefits is getting rid of shared parental leave and introducing some gender-neutral parental leave with that period of non-transferable leave for both, exactly the same as the previous panel.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christine. I just wanted to follow up on that point. We have all heard that increasing the rate of statutory pay would substantially increase the take-up of parental leave by dads. What compelling evidence do you have to support that? Yes.
So I think, again, if we just look at the cross-country statistics, that is very clear that once you increase pay, there is likely to be uptake. I personally would like to add a note of caution around this argument, though, that pay is the only thing, in work that Dr. Bendel and I did on class and shared parental leave. We think there are a couple of factors that would still suggest that even with a much better level of pay, there would still be disparity in terms of who is taking leave, and in particular, it's more likely that working class dads are still going to be underrepresented in taking a leave. And that's partly because, although we've heard a lot about how attitudes are changing towards gendered parenting roles, that obviously isn't always true across all sectors of society. So there is still some, or more perhaps, inclination towards traditional roles within working class parenting families. I would also add that when attitudes and behaviours clash, the research is very clear that it's attitudes that change rather than behaviour. So even if people are saying, yes, we're all for equal parenting, when push comes to shove and they don't have, or that becomes difficult, it's much more likely that the attitudes will shift rather than behaviour. And the other big factor, and I want to add a note of caution to this as I say it, but the other big factor that suggests that it won't lead to universal uptake is that even in these paradigm countries that we talk about in like Norway and Sweden, there is still, the research is still very clear that working class dads are still taking less. They are more likely to lose their leave rather than use it, compared to other dads or other parents. The note of caution is obviously that the situation in those countries is very different to the one in the UK, and I think this is an area that we do need a lot more research into, personally, in terms of how I think increasing pay will lead to a huge substantial change, but it might not lead to that huge substantial change in certain sectors of society.
Abby?
Can I just to comment briefly on that? So we're talking about sort of uptake given the current system, but just if I might briefly just talk through some of the research that we did. So, I mean, a lot of the discussion around the cost of this policy, obviously we're talking about pay and we're hoping that government will pay for it, which takes away some of the, unintended consequences of just a kind of business-funded policy. We know that there are benefits because there are direct benefits from increased tax revenues from more women entering the labour market, and there are also there are indirect benefits to the economy from women entering the labour market and having higher production. And we've calculated that there's something like a £200 million net cost, which is primarily sort of driven by the cost of paternity pay, but a 2.7 or 2.68 billion pound benefit, which is not to say that there isn't a cost of men leaving the labour market, but the benefit of women entering the labour market is just really dwarfing that number. So that's just a bit of context. But the reason that is relevant to what we're talking about here is that works, and that works in our country and it works in other countries if as many men as possible take up the policy. And currently we have a big gap in this country around self-employed fathers. So we can talk about uptake, as much as we want within the, subsection that we're talking about. But if a large section of our labour market, of our families, don't even have any access to paternity, pay or leave at all, then that's really going to stop this from being the kind of growth benefit policy that this has the possibility to be. We know that government really cares about growth. And if we want it to work, we are going to need something like a paternity allowance, something like something akin to a maternity allowance. So just a note that, take up is both to do with culture, it's also just to do with availability of the policy. And we know that loads of men, many of whom, and families, many of whom are on low incomes, running small businesses or single, working themselves, that's going to need to change if we want to harness the benefits, both at a household level and at a national level.
Thank you. I just had a quick question back again for Gemma around those cultural barriers that you talked about. What can government do to remove some of those cultural barriers, do you think? And should consideration of cultural factors be included in the government review?
Well, it's very hard, I think, to change some of those cultural factors. So in Sweden, as we've heard, parental leave and parenting equality has been on the agenda and pushed very hard for 5 decades since the 70s, and like I said, there is still this discrepancy between in terms of dads take up in class. In Sweden they famously did campaigning to try and promote the idea of dad's involvement. So, for example, on milk bottles and stuff like that, the government would promote the importance of dads and how good that can be. But I think one of the main things that we would need as a change is also some change to the workplace. And we know, again, in Dr. Bendels and I research, we know that in the more working class dominated workplaces, there's less positive attitudes towards taking leave, towards working flexibly, all of those sorts of things. So we need to find a way to drive that. What I always come back to in my research as a Labour lawyer, is the role of things like trade unions and workplace bodies to try and push that change on the ground. Joeli was saying earlier that the law should be an important start in terms of making that change, and I totally agree. But we do need to think a little bit about what happens in the workplace as well. So trade unions is the obvious place to start, but trade unions have been very much changed, and trade unions are now mainly working in more middle class dominated occupations, etc. But that seems to me a really obvious avenue to go down.
Thank you. Jemima.
Thank you. Could I think also we should think about this in a very long-term way and look at the way those norms and stereotypes are embedded from childhood. And Fawcett did a big piece of work a few years ago looking at the kind of the power and prevalence of those stereotypes, so that, for instance, by the time children are 6, they are more likely to associate kindness with girls and intelligence with boys. So we are consistently replicating and reinforcing these very restrictive ideas about what it means to be a girl and what it means to be a boy. And so we need a policy system around shared parental leave that facilitates and encourages change, but we do also need to get in there early and stop kind of reinforcing that. And that is about childcare settings and our education settings. It's also about responsibilities for corporates in the products they're creating, the messaging. There's really strong evidence that messaging on children's clothing reinforces these ideas, representations of children on television, the characters that they see in books. Still today, boys and male characters and white characters massively disproportionately represented versus girls and women, people of colour. So there's a kind of a broader responsibility there in stopping reinforcing these ideas about what girls do and what boys do, which is connected as well to inoculating young people against some of those far-right ideas being sort of proliferated by the likes of Andrew Tate, as well as preventing violence against women and girls. These are sort of the seeds of those attitudes.
Thank you. Iris.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to add to that as well, if I may. There was a video shared by BBC News recently from a nursery in Sweden, I think it was, where they showed boys and girls sort of switching stereotypes. So boys were being taught about kindness and gentle hands and caring, and young girls were being taught to be strong, and they sort of did that for an hour, and that was a really, really interesting watch. So I would implore the committee and others to definitely have a look at that. That was really interesting. I want to talk a little bit about barriers to take up. So, Dr. Mitchell, you used shared parental leave yourself, didn't you? What was your experience of the scheme?
Well, yeah, I didn't use it. My partner did. So I've only taken maternity leave. But yes, my partner did. So I would obviously I've been researching this for too long to remember. Well over 10 years ago, I started my PhD, which looked exactly at this. So in terms of people who were committed to using the scheme, I don't think you could have found anyone much more committed going into this. And obviously, that was a key concern in finding a partner as well who was also equally committed. So we went into it knowing that that was what we were going to do, and always being very clear on that. It was a really, really positive experience for my family. My partner took 5 months of leave. I took 7, so it was amazing, and the relationship that they have together as dad and son is amazing to watch. Sometimes they're too close and I get a little jealous, in fact. So it was undoubtedly, like Sarah said, for families like mine, it was a huge benefit. A couple of things to bear in mind though. So yeah, bearing in mind, I went in knowing about all the issues with notice requirements and stuff like that. It was still a nightmare working it out with HR, and it was still very difficult. My partner was the first man to ever take it at the organisation that he worked in, and I think if it wasn't for me kind of pushing it and being real Rottweilerish about it, it might not have happened so easily. There were comments, I know he had comments at work like, oh, how did you wangle that and stuff like that, because it was added like a bonus. So yeah, even going into it with that awareness, I would still say managing it was difficult. And the other thing that I wasn't expecting is when it came time to swap, I didn't want to do it, actually, and I did feel like I was giving away something that was mine. And Freddie, my partner, felt like he was taking something that was mine. And although it was the right decision, and I'm so glad we did it, if I'd made that decision at the 7 months, whether or not I was going to transfer it, I wouldn't have done it. And that's, like I said, someone who's gone in with about as much commitment to this as you could possibly imagine. So I would bear... I do think that idea, and that's one of the reasons I think one of the main problems with this transferable model is this default idea that it was mine was there, and that's what we need to challenge, and that's why I think transferable maternity leave is never going to work. I would also say that we fit fully into all of the other factors in terms of people that take this. I'm the higher earner out of the two of us, so we're bucking the gender pay gap trends. We're both dual income, and we're both in a very comfortable middle class sort of earning wage. So we don't buck any trends in any of those regards.
Brilliant, thank you. And you've mentioned obviously some of the complexities around the eligibility criteria and sort of employers' lack of understanding of the scheme. These have been identified as key flaws of the scheme anyway, in addition to what you've mentioned as well. How do you think those could be addressed, if at all?
Well, I think the fundamental way to address them is to get rid of the transferable model of leave. The difficulty is the conversing and handing notice to two employers. We did it in 2 blocks, so we did it as simply as possible. There was no further transferring or anything after that. But it was still such hard work, and getting HR to understand it was a lot more difficult than I anticipated. So yeah, again, this is another clear reason in my mind as to why the transferable model has to be scrapped and replaced with the gender neutral leave, with the blocks of non-transferable leave.
Thank you. And what do you think is the function of the current earnings criteria, and what would be the effects of scrapping them?
Sorry, what do you mean by the earnings criteria?
So around around the eligibility of sort of take up of the scheme and the earnings.
So the fact that it's the higher income people. Yeah. So I think that is. That's a good question. Does anyone?
Anyone else?
Anyone else have a go?
Yeah. So sorry to check my understanding, is the question about obviously you have to be both people in the partnership have to be an employee. So if, you know, I might be employed and my partner might be self-employed, then I can't access it, or vice versa. And I would say, yeah, it's a really substantial problem, particularly for this point that we've got to about if we really want to kind of normalise take-up and deal with those gaps, and particularly the ethnicity motherhood pay gap, where there's higher levels of self-employment and insecure work. We have to make this something that is for families and parents, not just for a kind of particular quote-unquote privileged group of employees. So we would absolutely support extending that eligibility.
Yes, I agree. Thank you very for clarifying that. Yes, I totally agree, and I think that is really key. I know we've talked a lot about self-employed workers as well, but as a lawyer, it's not even workers we are looking at employees, which is the highest level of protected workers, and you have to have been eligible, you have to have been in the same job for basically since the time of conception, and that just excludes too many people, and we know that excludes disproportionately members or working class families or people who are in precarious work, who we know are more likely to be from ethnic minority backgrounds, etc. All of these things. So it's all working to exclude the same people and to enable access to that different opposite group of people.
It creates these kind of perverse incentives and this kind of stickiness in employment where you can't move because, you know, you might end up having a baby, you might lose your entitlements for both parents, and then people, you know, are not getting those opportunities to increase their earnings through job moves, which is a really important way to do that. And employers are not kind of getting the right workers in the right place because there's this sort of stickiness in the labour market. So it's bad news all round.
Yeah. Thank you. And finally, Sarah, you favour relatively modest changes to paternity leave while keeping and reforming the shared parental leave scheme. Can your proposal overcome some of the concerns around shared parental leave's maternal transfer model, and how much impact on take-up would you expect your proposal to have?
I'm going to refer to my notes, just so I don't go over. Okay, so we put in a number of different proposals designed for different scenarios and objectives. So 2 key approaches are extending paternity leave and pay to 6 weeks at 90%, which moves us toward a more gender equal non-transferable leave. Obviously, still a big gap. But the second was actually improving take-up to SPL by combining increased paternity pay and shared parental pay. This would involve 2 weeks paternity leave at 90% pay, with the option of utilising 4 weeks of shared parental pay enhanced at 90% of pay if used by the parent that's not using maternity leave. This essentially allows dads and other parents up to 6 weeks of 90% pay, which will make leave much more accessible for all parents, including lower income parents, which there are obviously other issues at hand as well, but it would make it more accessible to lower income parents as long as eligibility is also tackled. This approach, unlike merely extending paternity leave to 6 weeks at 90% pay, also encourages the use of shared parental leave, a narrative and a change to cultural norms and shared caring, and could act as a catalyst for further use of shared parental leave and shared caring. While this approach doesn't overcome all the issues with the maternal transfer mechanism, it does encourage families to share care and support each other, and if such an approach was combined with a gradual increase in non-transferable well-paid leave for parents not using maternity leave, we could start to move away from the maternal transfer mechanism over time. So kind of like what was being referred to in relation to Spain. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Kiris. Thank you, Samantha. Thank you.
Oh God, I'm so sorry.
I empathise.
In my profession, this is most inconvenient. Just talking about international comparisons. To Jemima and Gemma, which countries' parental leave systems should the government be looking to for evidence to inform its review?
You go first.
So I think the Spanish model is interesting because it sort of over time stepped up provisions. So there's 16 weeks of full paid leave for fathers in Spain, and that, as I said, has very high take up. But I think what's interesting is the transition that they did, where they increased that over time from a very low level. Quebec also has a use it or lose it system, which is a really, I think we're all agreed, like a fundamental feature of a successful system. And you can see there, because they introduced that in Quebec but not in other areas of Canada, the significant impact it had on maternal employment and the pay gap. As well as, of course, the Scandinavian countries. I think the challenges there is that our wider kind of welfare system is so different that it can feel a bit distant. So it can be useful to look at kind of countries that have made that change in that shift from something that's a bit more similar to the way in which our model is established.
I'll just try to speak. It's interesting you mentioned Spain, because that got mentioned in the previous panel as well. What are, you say use it or lose it in Quebec, but what Quebec doing in terms of time frame and levels of pay?
Can you speak to that, Sarah? Give me a moment.
Back to that.
Yeah.
Gemma, we put you on the spot.
So I would agree, obviously. I mean, there's a reason that we always talk about the Scandinavian countries, and that is because what they're doing has proven to be so effective. But obviously there are concerns about following that same trajectory. Portugal has been interesting in terms of, as a country that has stuck with transferable leave, but that has had slightly more success because they have introduced a bonus month of paid leave if the dad takes a month of leave by himself. So that's quite an interesting one, and certainly the uptake in Portugal is much better than here. For example, I don't have the figures in front of me, I'm afraid, but it's around 50%, and it's obviously, again, it's improving all the time. So there are other ways we could look at the transferable model. However, I do think there are, in some ways, limited lessons we could learn from Portugal, even though that does sound good in theory. And that's partly because of the short amount of time that's available in Portugal, like Spain, where they're looking at a much shorter condensed period of leave anyway. So if the option is 5 or 6 months of leave, then 6 months is obviously, that's kind of much, you're still in kind of a key part of small babydom, I think, at that point, where another month would sound much more appealing. And again, it's at high pay. Whereas if we introduce something like that here, I would have more concerns. So would there be the same advantage, for example, to making it 12 to 13 months? Is that going to be as appealing to parents? And certainly it won't be if we stick with the bad model of low pay.
Can we try just to condense some of the answers? Thank you. No, they're really good. But if there's anything that you think actually you need to go into more detail, please follow it up with written evidence. Thank you.
Mr. Sarah, can you explain why you're sceptical about the feasibility of directly replicating in the UK the much more equal parental leave systems of some other countries?
So essentially what we're proposing is something similar, it's something similar to what has been suggested in Spain, which is to use shared parental leave to create a norm, to change this idea of, who's caring for the child. It's trying to actually make sure that we are addressing those cultural expectations that are basically present, saying, Mum, you stay at home, look after the child, Dad, I go to work, We're trying to make sure that it is utilised to create change. So just making sure, in a way, is that answering the question? I might have gone there. I can't quite recall the question itself.
No, it was to do with you're sceptical about the feasibility of directly replicating the UK, about having equal parental leave systems.
Yes. So what would happen is that if we don't, we need to kind of work toward creating that change, or having established change in actual uptake in parental leave. So again, using the shared parental leave system with paternity leave, we're actually prioritising creating cultural shift in who is caring for the child. So if we were to essentially, if we're not against, and this is the thing, we actually put it forward as another proposal. We were addressing the question of how to increase uptake of shared parental leave with the inclusion of that proposal using shared parental leave. But if there was just the increase to 6 weeks with paternity leave, for example, what we would see is that we would have some increase in paternity leave, but then it would hit a ceiling. So what we're actually trying to say is that it's really important that we ask the question, where do we want to get to in relation to achieving, more equal parenting, or a better opportunity for achieving equal parenting, and using shared parental leave is certainly one way to do it. So we want to try and make sure that we address those cultural barriers that are preventing more shared care in the meantime.
Thank you. Thank you, Samantha. Catherine.
Thank you, and thank you all so much for coming to the panel today. I've learnt so much already. So this is a question for Jemima, please, and this is about the full review of parental leave that's coming up. So could you share what you think should be the broad objectives of the government's proposed parental leave review?
Absolutely. So I think overall this has to be about increasing uptake and equalising those unpaid caring responsibilities and getting as close to equal as we can be, or the opportunity for it to be equal within households where they're kind of making sort of encumbered choices. It needs to take into account supporting women's employment and their return to employment, fathers' time to bond with their children and support their partners. It's also important that we retain the recognition that birth has a physical impact on women, and there should be time in recognition of that and the recovery needed, and support for breastfeeding where women choose to do that as well. But it's a vital part of supporting a more equal economy and economic growth, as well as child development outcomes.
Okay, thank you. And by which metrics and what time scale do you think should success be measured? That's probably also to Jemima, but if anyone wants to chip in, you can.
So I would say, it will take a period of time for take-up to improve, but I think actually JRF have some evidence about this sort of things playing out within a couple of years, which perhaps, Abby, you would want to speak to. I don't want to use your evidence while you're here.
No. So I think we should probably frame this in terms of benefits and not just costs, right? Because there will be an upfront cost to government. But what the work that we've been doing with the Centre for Progressive Policy shows is that impacts are likely to be felt around 2 to 3 years after the policy is introduced, and that's what we see in other countries. And the main sort of driver there is people learning about the policy, taking it up in the workplace, just having babies. So these changes don't happen initially, but what that does mean is as these changes and as the take-up starts to increase, that's when you start seeing the growth benefits. And those benefits, and I guess to jump on your question, Catherine, I think government needs to frame this around what are the changes that you'll see at household level. What is the kind of increased freedom, the increased space and agency around choices that you'll see at the household level, which will make a really measurable difference within this parliament. But then what are the bigger economic changes that we will see? And the main driver of that, what sounds like a pretty big number, right? Like 2.7 billion pound benefit. The main driver there is women making the choice in their households to go out to work when previously they wouldn't have done so before, and that could be to go back to work sooner, or it could be a broader cultural change. The choices that are being made between partners are such that you see dads staying home more with their kids, and actually you get much more free decisions about who stays home and looks after the kids and who goes out to work. And I think that's the kind of cultural change that we're looking for, right? We want to see a systemic change in the choices that people make. That's ultimately what's going to get more money in the pockets of families, more money in the pockets of women down the line, and change the sort of norm that we have that women women stay home, look after the kids, and dads go out to work. And so, yeah, as I said, it's 2 to 3 years. Our model looks at 19 countries, so it's a really big sample, and that covers off, you've got your European, your Scandinavian countries, you've got your southern, European countries as well that have a really different system as well, and you've got some North American areas as well. So this is not a culturally bounded, model and evidence that we're looking at. We're looking across the piece. The thing that connects all of this work is what happens when you give people 1 additional week or 2 additional weeks or 3 additional weeks of paternity leave, and all of the benefit comes from the amount of pay that you that is there to incentivize dads.
Thank you very much. And finally, again to you, Abby, how would you like to see the review conducted of parental leave? Include a full public consultation or more targeted work with employers, for example?
I won't repeat what I've just said, but I think definitely needs to work with employers. That's so important. We've talked about take-up in terms of individual, and household choices, but a lot of this is, as you said, what is the culture of the workplace? Is your boss saying, oh, you're going to have a baby? Like, that sounds really exciting. Do you know when you're going to be taking your paternity leave? Or are they saying, oh, are they sort of, and not very supportive of that? So this is really about making it work for employers. We know that employers are going to be having a lot of change with the employment bill. This is not about, bearing down on employers. This is about saying, actually, at a macro level, at a workforce level, you will see real benefits. You will see, happier workers. But the way to do that is to engage with employers at the outset.
Thank you.
Thank you. Last couple of questions, and these are also for you, Abby. What do you think would be the advantages of the government using the model recently developed by yourselves with the Centre for Progressive Policy in assessing the economic impacts of parental leave reform?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is, the government and DBT will have brilliant economists that are thinking about this question, I hope. But so this is not to say that work isn't already happening. I think the reason we wanted to do this work at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation is that we get so bogged down in the cost of policy. We're so sort of weary of hearing that X policy will cost X billion pounds, and it just feels like, that there isn't much, fiscal space to do anything. But there are policy changes that will have a net benefit, and we wanted to explore what those benefits were. And as I said earlier, this is not about saying that there are no costs at all. Like, we need to be grown up about what the cost of this policy will be. We need government to fund paternity pay. We need a paternity allowance so that self-employed dads and families aren't missed out. However, those changes will have an impact. There will be a benefit, and it will pay, which is really brilliant. It's quite rare in social policy. I work for a anti-poverty charity, and a lot of what we do is talk about the cost of policies. But this policy has an actual measurable benefit. So I'm really hoping that government is framing this in time in the ways that we have done so with this model, and hopefully building upon it.
Do you think it's realistic to expect that rather than their usual focus on direct fiscal implications?
Well, I think this is a much bigger conversation than I think this room, and it probably extends far into the Treasury. I guess what I'd say is, we have tried to be as conservative and robust as we can be. As I said, we've looked at 25 studies, we've looked at 19 countries. We are focused on something very specific, which is for every additional week of paternity leave that you give families, what is the cost and what is the benefit? And there are much wider benefits that we haven't tabulated, things like the health benefits or the wider social benefits. This is very specific around the economy, because that's what we think that the current political discussion is missing, and what it needs right now. I think that's why.
Thank you. And how confident are you that the net economic benefits of reform would actually be realised over 2 or 3 years, say?
I mean, that's a really good question. So we are relying on international data here. I mean, part of the reason we're all in this room is because we don't have the support that we need yet. There isn't that much evidence which shows exactly how long this will take, but there is one very robust paper which says that the benefits tend to be realised around 2 to 3 years, which is to do with, as I said, take up, people learning about the policy. But we do also see variance between countries. So just as an example, one of the areas that the model was looking at was California, and the benefits in that area were extremely low, partly because very few fathers took up that support. Conversely, in Iceland, there was a huge amount of support that was taken up, and that really turbocharged the growth benefits. And both of those areas started with a very low level. So everything we've been looking at is starting from a very low level, getting to a higher level. So, we are trying to control for at least the situation that we have now, which is we're starting from a very low level. But, this is not to say that I can say 100% that it will be 2 to 3 years, but this is the evidence we have available, and we really hope that the government is taking this kind of evidence into account to make sure that they're not just looking at this as a balance sheet loss, but also a balance sheet gain.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much to all of you for your expertise and your time today as well, and for coming at the beginning of this session and listening to what the first panel said as well. So it's been a really informative session. Thank you so much. That brings this session to a close. Order.